Welcome to History of the Ancient Near East. I'm your instructor along the journey, Justin Singleton. Now, just like last time, please forgive me if this lecture goes a bit wonky because I'm trying to do less editing in order to get these lectures out a little quicker. All right, now we're beginning to discuss the Iron Age, and we're going to start with the end of the Middle Assyrian period and then go up to the Neo-Assyrian period. Now, we're beginning by discussing the Middle Assyrian period because the Middle Assyrian period began in the Late Bronze Age and then carried into the Iron Age. We'll then move on to the Neo-Elamite period, discussing the origins of Elam and the Elamites' control. Finally, we will discuss the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and in particular, the difficulties in administering this expanding empire, which some argue was the world's first true empire. And we'll also discuss this concept of resettling conquered peoples. Now, the Bronze to Iron Age transition in the Near East is sometimes clearly defined, but sometimes it's not so clear. Iron innovation in the region appears to have been a result of the Bronze Age collapse, particularly as iron-bearing people groups moved into the Near East after or during the collapse. Now, forgive me for running down a little rabbit trail here, but as I was going over this lecture, I realized that I hadn't really talked about the use of iron that much, so let me just throw this out there. Iron ore was extremely difficult to work with. You had to burn the fires hotter and longer, use more fuel, so it was a very difficult material. Now, people were working with iron. They were using iron for a long time before, during the Bronze Age. But they were making things like little pendants, jewelry, maybe a dagger, and they were using meteorite iron. The stuff was just way too difficult to work with to make it any use out of or for weapons or tools or anything else. It's just too difficult. Well, why did they start using iron then? Well, that's because of the Bronze Age collapse. You remember this trade network that was vast, going all over the place. It completely shut down. And so people no longer had access to tin or copper or whatever other materials they might need. So they had to start using resources that were close at hand. In this case, iron. Now, it was more difficult to work with, but what are they going to do? They have to do it. And these people who moved into the land, the sea peoples, they figured out, although it's harder to work with, it's a whole lot better than bronze. So now having the iron implements moving into the land, that gave them, it gave them a leg up on everybody else. So this use of iron is kind of a strange concept because I don't know if you've realized it, but humanity tends to be rather lazy. And we don't really do things unless it can save us time. And so this using iron, which is harder to work with, isn't really saving time, but they had to do it. And upon doing it, they're like, wow, this stuff is good. All right, there's my little rabbit trail. Forgive me for jumping into that. All right, moving back down to the lecture now, forgive me. One characteristic of the early Iron Age across the Near East and into Europe and other parts of Asia was a prolonged period of an arid climate. The lake levels dropped, rain levels reduced, the temperature lowered by an average of 2 degrees Celsius. So this Bronze Age climate catastrophe, if you will, the effects of it continued into Iron 1. Now, in Mesopotamia, the end of the Bronze Age and move into the Iron Age saw changes in almost all major powers, except one, the Middle Assyrian Empire. which spanned the Late Bronze Age, Iron Age transition. Now, later in the Iron Age, the Neo-Assyrian Empire would develop from the Middle Assyrian, but the Neo-Elamite and Neo-Babylonian empires also form. The Middle Assyrian period extended from the Late Bronze Age well into the Iron Age, the only Late Bronze Age power in the region to survive the crisis years of the Bronze Age collapse. The Middle Assyrian period, as noted before, saw a change in kingship, administration, and even religion, becoming more and more adapted to broader Mesopotamian culture. By the end of the period, in the 10th century, the culture between the Middle and Neo-Assyrian empires would be difficult to differentiate. But the political differences became evident when, after years of patterns of weakness and revival diminished the Assyrian state, a succession of kings expanded Assyrian control once again, establishing the new Assyrian Empire. Now, having discussed the Elamites only a little, as they're technically outside of the Near East and in the Iranian Plateau and Zagros Highlands, a short description is needed here. The word Elam appears to literally mean highland, as in reference to the highlands of the Zagros. These are the Highlanders. Elam is first recognized in the Bible in Genesis 10:22, where the personal name Elam is referenced as a son of Shem, along with Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram, the first and last of whom are known from the broader Mesopotamian region. Thus, biblically, the Elamites are a Semitic group. Now, with that said, Elamite as a language is a linguistic isolate, meaning that the origins of the language remain obscure. Now, because the Elamite language does not appear to have any Semitic cognates, that's like linguistic cousins, if you will, the Elamites are considered non-Semitic. Several possibilities may account for the Semitic, non-Semitic controversy, including that the biblical record is simply incorrect. On the other hand, as little is known of the Elamites early on, the fact that Proto-Elamitic script has yet to be fully deciphered, it's uncertain if the Elamites later referred to were in fact the same people group at all. Much like how the biblically Hamitic Canaanites were later replaced by a Semitic group at the beginning of the Bronze Age who retained the same name, so the biblical Elamites may have faced a similar fate. Now, as a people group, the Elamites constantly acted as a thorn in the side of the ancient Mesopotamians, even though they were culturally influenced by the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians. They were the longtime enemies of those peoples, most notably destroying the Kassite kingdom and plundering the stela that was the code of Hammurabi. It should be noted that the Elamites were not always enemies, as peaceful relations did at times occur, even including the hiring or inspiring of Elamite mercenaries. During the reign of Ashurbanipal of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, an uneasiness in Elam develops when the king was murdered by his brother, causing many of the princes to flee to Assyria. These Elamite princes were then educated at the court of Ashurbanipal, later to be installed as puppet rulers in Elam. The beginning of the Neo-Elamite period, Neo-Elamite I, dating from around 1000 to about 750 or 700 BC, is poorly known as no texts have been discovered and the links to Mesopotamia are minimal. During the Neo-Elamite II period, dating around 770 to 585 BC, is seen a series of battles and wars against the Neo-Assyrians, culminating in the capture of Susa, the Neo-Elamite capital. This period is somewhat well documented in Assyrian sources. The capital of Elam, Susa, was somewhat protected by marshlands, but the proximity to southern Mesopotamian cities, especially when compared to the highland Elamite settlements, made Susa not only a suitable target for the Assyrians, but made the Elamites susceptible to Mesopotamian developments, including war-related developments. In fact, the Elamite archers were well known, and the Elamites were something of archery specialists. From Elamite inscriptions at Susa, only 5 kings are known, but others, as well as details concerning both political and military affairs, are known from Mesopotamian sources, primarily Neo-Assyrian royal annals. The 8th and 7th centuries BC are characterized by Elamite-Assyrian conflicts, a key point of which included the founding of a new Elamite dynasty around 760 BC that ushered in Neo-Elamite II, and the defeats of the Neo-Assyrian Sargon II shortly thereafter. By Neo-Elamite III, there are seen close ties between the Elamites and the Persians, who are out of the purview of this study. The establishment of the new or Neo-Assyrian Empire came after years of a pattern of alternating weaknesses and revival, beginning with Tiglath-Pileser II in 966 BC, and extending until its fall at the hands of the Babylonians and Medes in 609 BC. The regime is arguably the first world empire, though the successes of the Neo-Assyrian Empire are firmly rooted in the Middle Assyrian period. The period continued many of the Middle Assyrian traditions, and as noted before, the cultural shift between the Middle and Neo-Assyrian periods is difficult to differentiate. The new empire expanded in connection to the ideological programs of leaders such as Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, who gave a theological justification for their successes, a concept of substantiating the reasons for war based on the will of the gods that began in the region as early as 2400 BC. Now, of course, the many successes of the Neo-Assyrian kings no doubt owed largely to the professional army under their control that stood at the forefront of technological progress. As early as Ashurbanipal during the Middle Assyrian period, documentation exists for the dissecting of the empire into administrative units and provinces. During the Neo-Assyrian period, Tiglath-Pileser III rearranged the districts, and Sargon II created a bureaucratic organization to maintain the provincial system. Appointed governors of these provinces were required to maintain roads and infrastructure, levy and collect taxes, distribute land, preserve order, and of course command the local garrison. While vassal states of the empire paid tribute, the differing Assyrian provinces, those regions that had been directly conquered by Syria, paid a type of grain tax, as well as customs duties. Unfortunately, these obligations at times made life unbearable, perhaps due to another of the key ideological concepts championed by Neo-Assyrian leadership that became a long-lasting legacy of the empire: the forced resettlement of entire people groups. This systematic resettlement or deportation of conquered peoples had a twofold benefit for Assyrian governance, namely pertaining to resource management and the reduction of rebellion due to patriotic resentment. The two-way resettlement of groups surely lowered the possibility of rebellion, but it also moved peoples into lands of which they were not familiar, and into which others may had already been present. While the Assyrian overlords attempted to treat fairly all those who were resettled, and in fact resettlement was seen as a privilege rather than a punishment, the heavy grain taxation of a defeated people surely caused problems. For one, many of the peoples attempted to retain their traditional lifestyle. This concept is noted by Josephus in his Antiquities, where A group was moved into Samaria in the southern Levant, worshiping their native gods and, according to Josephus, provoking Yahweh. The land of Samaria became impoverished to the point that taxes could not be extracted, likely due to the great amount of time that it takes to create an economic surplus, particularly with a diminished populace. Tiglath-Pileser III having moved the Israelites out of the land, and Sargon II having resettled the area with Arabs years later, essentially restarting the agricultural narrative of the land. Of interest, of the Neo-Assyrian sites throughout the empire studied thus far, about 40% are established on virgin soil, meaning a brand new life for many. Now, these people benefited from Assyrian dominance in the form of new technologies and industries, for example, the creation of canal systems or the establishment of new crops. Assyrian administrators also built and maintained highways for the movement of information and goods, all to the benefit of the states and the people. Many have attempted to locate the so-called 10 lost tribes of Israel, but it's possible that these simply became absorbed into other groups, taking advantage of the Neo-Assyrian quote-unquote privileges. Now, discovering the lost tribes of Israel would be fun, but I doubt that it'll ever happen. They disobeyed God, and they were taken away for it. One of my professors jokingly said that they were probably eaten by the Ummanda, but discussing those people doesn't really fall into this course. As always, feel free to contact me if you need anything.